My name is Patsy Ramsey, and I'm 5.5.
And that's backwards.
How do you prove you're not guilty?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 16 of the Khan's Order, and it deals with the second stipulation to prove whether a statement is defamatory. Were the statements made with malice? And we're going to be dealing with that in this episode. Something just to let you guys know about, I'm narrating the CRAVEN Silence 2 on Patreon. I've just finished the end of the first section, and now we're moving on to chapter 8. And a couple of things that I forgot that I knew, I guess, is the following. A few things that have just come through while narrating these narratives that I obviously wrote some time ago. One of them was that Officer Scott Adams was staying with the Ramseys at the time, and you never really hear about him. If you do a Google search, he never comes up. I don't think he's mentioned in the Lawrence Schiller narrative, which is very, very comprehensive. I think Steve Thomas might know a little bit about those individuals. Scott Adams. So on the day that JonBenet was found, so the day after Christmas, after about 6 o'clock, around about between 6 and 7 o'clock, perhaps closer to 7 o'clock, Officer Scott Adams relieved Officer Morgan, who was staying with the Ramseys. Now, one wonders what they saw, and it just is interesting that you never really hear about from either of these officers, and they were on the scene, right? So I think that's a fragment of the puzzle that would be worth knowing more about. So I have to say, if any of those officers are listening or people who know them, it would be good if they could get in touch and with anybody, whether it's a reporter, whether it's with me, whether it's with Steve Thomas. It would be interesting to know. So that's the one thing. Another thing that is quite interesting is that Lou Smith on Larry King said something along the lines of, John and Patsy Ramsey have been interrogated more than anybody I've ever seen. I don't know if I agree. I would say that Chris Watts was interrogated more than they were. If you put the total time together, that the Ramseys were interrogated and the time that Chris Watts was interrogated, it was easily double the amount of time. If you want to talk about interrogated by the media, well, then that's a different conversation. But then the difference is that Chris Watts didn't call the reporters onto his porch, whereas the Ramseys did. So I think that's quite an interesting distinction. And then another interesting point just to highlight is at one point when Lou Smith went on to Larry King, and this is around the time the Ramseys were publishing and publicizing their book, Larry asked, "Can you learn a lot from talking to the Sun?" meaning Burke Ramsey, and Smith responded, I've never really had a long, in-depth interview with the Sun." It's quite incredible that Lou Smith, the famous detective, didn't really do that, and one wonders whether that was an option for him. If he wanted to talk to Burke, could he have? But it is a bit of a strange thing that seems to be a bit of an oversight from the detective. Anyway, Larry responded at the time. He apparently said Burke might have a temper. He might have known other people who have been prowling around. I mean, wouldn't he be someone to talk to? These are Larry King's words to Lou Smith. And then he said, Lou responded, "I think that it's very necessary to talk to the Sun. Burke Ramsey was a 9-year-old boy at the time that this happened." And then he says he was interviewed exclusively afterwards. But I think what is missing from that is when he was spoken to by Suzanne Bernhard, she wasn't a police officer, and she wasn't asking the sort of questions and follow-up questions that the police wanted asked. So those are just a couple of observations that I've made that I think are quite interesting. In the previous video, I kind of raised the question that Patsy herself asked, how do you prove you're not guilty? And I think there are two ways to answer this. The one is in a hypothetical scenario where Patsy was guilty of something. Let's say, whatever the grand jury voted to indict her on. So if Patsy was guilty of something, what could she do to make it look as though she wasn't guilty? Well, what about writing a ransom note? What about calling friends over? What about hiding behind a veil of tears? What about sort of hysterically praying to God and kind of having that pageantry as a sort of affront? Because what was interesting is, if you go through the timeline of the events as they played out, Patsy was the least. I don't want to say that she didn't cooperate, but it was a situation where they felt they couldn't speak to her because she was either very heavily medicated or very emotional. But you could also say that, well, if you are guilty of something, wouldn't you want to project that so that you don't need to be spoken to? And of course, after that initial rebuff, sorry, she's not in a state to be spoken to. Well, they then didn't speak to her for 4 months. It wasn't as though she calmed down and she was then off the medication and then she spoke to the police, say, in early January. Right. Bear in mind, she spoke to the media essentially before she spoke to the police. Right. And she wasn't in such a state that she couldn't tell the police officer, Linda Arndt, that she suspected the housekeeper. That was on the day that JonBenet disappeared. Right. So I think in a scenario where you say, well, hypothetically, if Patsy was involved somehow, what sort of things could she do to prove she was innocent? Well, one is, how about write a ransom note, right? On the other hand, if she felt that she was going to be suspected of something that she didn't do, what could she do to prove her innocence? Well, I think there are two answers to that. The one is talk to the police, talk to, I guess, the media as well, but basically be transparent and do it very quickly. And perhaps she was dissuaded from doing that by lawyers, right? The other thing could be, what if you don't believe, or what if you suspect that you're not going to be believed? You're innocent, but you suspect that you're not going to be believed. Perhaps you'd write a ransom note as well. Or was the ransom note written to protect herself and to protect other people? Was it one, both? What do you think? Right, so now we go into the Khan's order. We're on the middle of page 64. Were the statements made with malice? And so let's go right into it. Quote, in addition to proving that the published statements were indeed defamatory, and these published statements are referring to, I guess, what the Ramseys wrote in The Death of Innocence, plaintiff, that is Chris Wolf, bears the additional burden of establishing that the defendants acted with actual malice. Isn't there a movie by that name? In any event, that's quite difficult to do, to make the case that the Ramseys accused him out of malice, right? And I think that Chris Wolf and Dana Hoffman thought they had quite a strong case, because they could say Patsy Ramsey wrote the ransom note, and Patsy Ramsey killed JonBenet, and thus her implicating him shows actual malice. But it wasn't quite as simple as that. First of all, they had some very good legal representation, and they actually managed to convince the judge that Patsy didn't write the ransom note, and further, and we're going to get to that in the next couple of videos, that a non-Ramsey killed JonBenet. So in other words, a non-Ramsey, an intruder, an outsider, killed JonBenet. Something else that I realized that I didn't know, I'm not sure if you would know this. If you go to the timeline dealing with the day after Christmas, specifically the events in the evening from around about 7 o'clock onwards, there are a couple of things that are quite interesting. First of all, John Ramsey took a walk with John Fernie and Dr. Booth. There's no indication when Dr. Booth arrived or who called him. Dr. Booth was John Benet's pediatrician and quite a staunch defender of the Ramseys. The other thing that I think is worth noting is that John Ramsey went to Denver International Airport at 9:15 that night to pick up his brother Jeff. And bear in mind, at this point, John Benet's body was actually still in the house, in the house in 15th Street. At this point, of course, the Ramseys were at the Fernies, right? The other thing that I think you may not be aware of is that at 10:25, so about an hour after John left to go to Denver International Airport, Patsy got up. She'd obviously been sleeping. She'd possibly been given a sedative. But it is interesting that Patsy was sleeping at that time. Well, that is, I guess, what's assumed by she got up. One assumes that she slept. The other thing that is interesting is John and Patsy lay down, which I think also suggests that they were sleeping. That's between 9 o'clock that evening and 10:25 for Patsy, where for John, I think John only slept about 15 minutes or something like that. But it is interesting that they lay down. It doesn't say that they slept, but I mean, why else would you lie down? Perhaps to rest. Anyway, that is from Steve Thomas's notes. And also from Steve Thomas's notes, apparently Patsy got up an hour after John had left for the airport and asked where John was, and also asked where Burke was. And then she apparently sobbed. Now, I'm not sure who she was talking to at this point. I don't know whether one of the officers overheard this, but she apparently sobbed, "Why did they do this? Why did they do this?" And then she asked for a Valium. And this is from Steve Thomas's notes, right? Now, I think you can read something into that or not. You can read something into why did they do this being intruders, and they doesn't necessarily mean one person or two people. Sometimes you just say, because why would you say, why did he do this or why did she do this when you don't know who it is? So sometimes they, even though it's plural, can suggest a singular person. So I'm just playing devil's advocate on that aspect. But if you assume that Patsy's got guilty knowledge, then you might wonder what she was saying by saying that. Why did they do this? And who could that involve? Personally, I don't think it involved John. And so if it is plural, who do you think that could have involved? If it was true and if it was plural and if she was revealing guilty knowledge. I just think it's an interesting thing to consider. So let's return to the Khan's order, and the statement goes on to say, plaintiff bears this additional burden because he has stipulated that for all purposes of this litigation, he's a limited purpose public figure. And then it describes a limited purpose public figure as an individual who voluntarily injects himself or is drawn into a particular public controversy and therefore becomes a public figure for a limited range of issues. And then there's quite a lot of case knowledge there. I'm not sure if I'm going to go into it. Referring to actual malice is knowledge that the defamatory matter was false or that it was published with reckless disregard for whether it was false or not. So in terms of this question of actual malice, the person's got to have known that what they were saying was false and that it was published with reckless disregard for whether it is false or not. What do you think of that? It goes on to say, plaintiff must prove falsity by clear and convincing evidence. So that's not so easy. You might say, you know what, I think there was actual malice. I think there was reckless disregard. I think, right? But in order to do that, you've got to prove it in a clear way. You've got to have clear and ambiguous and convincing evidence. And so in terms of clear and convincing evidence, I think the case law that is referred to, I'm not going to refer to the actual cases, just the merits of them. They say something about, in the mind of the trier of fact, a firm belief or conviction as to the truth of the allegations sought to be established, evidence so clear, direct, and weighty and convincing as to enable the fact finder to come to a clear conviction without hesitancy of the truth of the precise facts in issue. It's really kind of a lot of legal gobbledygook, isn't it? Goes on to say, in other words, the clear and convincing evidence places in the ultimate fact finder an abiding conviction that the truth of the factual contentions are highly probable. So obviously the fact that they've disproved the ransom note, that already muddies the issue, doesn't it? It goes on to refer to the 11th Circuit as adopted as binding precedent decisions of the former 5th Circuit. Okay, so I'm not going to go into that. Let's go to page 66. So now we are on the 2/3 mark through the order, approximately. Plaintiff attempts to prove actual malice by what he asserts is clear and convincing evidence that the defendants actually killed John Bonet and therefore made the above libelous statements that plaintiff was a viable suspect, knowing that such statements were untrue. As this is defendant's motion for summary judgment, all factual inferences must be drawn in favor of the plaintiff. Further, as there is little factual dispute between the parties as to the evidence that exists, the court will review each party's theory of the crime and the evidence proffered. So this is quite interesting. In order to settle the dispute, the court now has got to review each party's theory, right? And we know the Wolf Party theory is that Patsy did it. Patsy wrote the ransom note. Patsy did it. And also it's sort of taking what Steve Thomas believed. But then the alternate theory is going to be Lou Smith's theory. And that is what they proffered to Judge Carnes. Now, the interesting thing is the grand jury rejected the intruder theory. But bear in mind, the grand jury had two theories that were presented to them. They were presented with a lot of evidence, including from the housekeeper, including from Burke Ramsey, including from friends, including from, the FBI profiler John Douglas. Lou Smith presented, right? So you had a lot of time to provide a balanced presentation of opposing theories, and in that case, the grand jury rejected the intruder theory, right? In this case, it seems like there was a lot of basically just resting on their laurels, that they thought it would just be quite a simple case of, well, if you believe Patsy wrote the ransom note, then that's it. And they couldn't even get over that hurdle. I don't know what the grand jury decided in terms of the ransom note. I do know that the housekeeper testified at length during the grand jury thing, and I know the housekeeper has said that she recognized mannerisms, things that Patsy would say in the statements of the handwriting, and also certain idiosyncrasies in the handwriting, such as abbreviations and so on. So the housekeeper saying, I think it's Patsy's handwriting, if that is what she testified, I think would be quite strong evidence in the mind of the jury. One also wonders whether Burke Ramsey was asked, when he testified, does this look like your mother's handwriting? It would be interesting just to know if he was asked that and what he answered. We don't know because it's secret. So anyway, the Khan's order goes on to say, the court will compare the evidence in order to determine whether the record supplies clear and convincing support for the proposition that defendants are responsible for the murder of their child. So what this is really saying is they're now going to consider a Patsy did it theory versus the intruder theory. In other words, Lou Smith's theory. And so they are going to go into Lou Smith's testimony and Lou Smith's ideas, and they're going to see, is it clear and convincing, right? And this is one of the most incredible parts of the Khan's order, what happens as they test Lou Smith's intruder theory. So anyway, it goes on to say, if the record does not contain such evidence, defendant's motion for summary judgment must be granted. If the record does contain sufficient information from which a reasonable fact finder could impute criminal culpability to defendants, however, the court must deny defendant's motion for summary judgment. And we'll be dealing with that in the next episode. Don't miss it. Episode 17 in the Khan's order. So look out for that in the next episode in the series. It'll likely be up tomorrow. Thank you for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do like, share, leave a comment, and I'll see you guys next time.